Right next to the most famous two words in the entire Bible sits a word that sounds like a horse. Not a metaphor, an actual, documented Greek usage, borrowed from descriptions of animals snorting and straining, agitated almost to the point of violence. And it isn't describing the crowd standing around Jesus at a graveside. It's describing Jesus. Most people who know Jesus wept is the shortest verse in the Bible have never once been shown the words sitting directly before it and directly after it. A word John reaches for twice, bracketing the tears on both sides, that almost no translation lets you read as forcefully as it was actually written. Once you see it, the two words everyone memorized stop looking like the whole story. They start looking like the calm eye of something a lot rougher. Ask someone who grew up in church what Jesus wept means, and you'll usually get some version of the same answer. Proof he was fully human, a small tender detail before the big miracle, a moment of gentle grief right before Lazarus walks out of the tomb. It's a nice reading. It's also missing the two verses standing guard on either side of it. John 11:33 says Jesus saw Mary weeping and the mourners with her weeping, and in the same sentence that he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. John 11:38 says he comes to the tomb groaning in himself again. Two uses of the same unusual verb, one right before the famous tears, one right after. And most English translations reach for words soft enough that a reader has no reason to suspect anything sharper is underneath. Troubled, deeply moved, words that could describe almost any strong feeling. The actual Greek verb underneath them is doing something much more specific and much less gentle than either translation lets on. Part of the reason this gets missed is structural, not careless. Bibles are printed with a verse number standing alone before every sentence, and Jesus wept happens to be short enough to fit entirely within its own number, on its own line, with nothing forcing a reader's eye toward verse 33 or verse 38 sitting on either side of it. Chapter and verse numbers weren't part of the original text at all. They were added centuries later, purely for reference, so a preacher or reader could find a passage quickly. They were never meant to signal where one thought ends and another begins, but in practice, that's exactly what they end up doing to a reader's instincts. A short verse standing on its own number reads like a short, self-contained thought, even when the surrounding Greek was never written to be read that way.
Here's what this video actually walks through. The specific Greek word behind groaned, where else it shows up in the Gospels and what it means there, the single word reserved for Jesus' own quiet tears and nowhere else in the entire New Testament, and the honest scholarly disagreement about exactly what or who that groaning is aimed at. By the end, Jesus wept won't read as a soft, stand-alone moment anymore. It'll read as the eye of a storm. If unpacking a verse everyone thinks they already know is what you come here for, hit like and subscribe. There's more of this coming. And if grief in your own life has ever felt more like anger than sadness, keep this one close. There's a moment near the end worth sending to someone. Start with the word doing the least surprising work. In John 11:33, weeping, used twice in one sentence, once for Mary and once for the mourners around her, translates klaiō, the Gospel's ordinary word for loud, public, communal grief. It's the same verb used of Rachel weeping for her children in Matthew 2:18, and of the widow of Nain grieving her only son in Luke 7:13, visible, audible mourning, sometimes amplified by professional mourners hired specifically for the job. Nothing unusual about klaiō showing up in a house full of grieving neighbors. It's exactly the word the scene calls for. First-century Jewish mourning customs make this ordinary use of klaiō even more expected than a modern reader might realize. Hired mourners and flute players were a standard part of a household in grief, expected to arrive quickly and wail loudly enough to be heard well beyond the immediate family. Public, professional, deliberately audible sorrow, not a private matter kept behind closed doors. By the time Jesus arrives, Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days, long enough that Martha will point out plainly a few verses later that decomposition is already underway. There's no ambiguity in the text about whether he's genuinely dead, and no ambiguity why the house is full of exactly this kind of loud, communal klaiō grief by the time Jesus walks in. Both Martha and Mary, arriving separately, greet him with the identical accusing sentence, "Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died." Grief and something close to reproach folded into the same 4 words, spoken twice by 2 sisters independently arriving at the same conclusion.
What's unusual sits in the very next clause of the same verse. He groaned in the spirit and was troubled. One Greek verb, embrimaomai. Outside the New Testament, its core sense belongs to horses, snorting, straining, agitated almost to the point of violence, the sound an animal makes fighting against something. Inside the Gospels, the same verb shows up a handful of other times, and in every other case it's translated sternly charged or strictly warned. Jesus using this exact root to forcefully instruct someone to stay quiet right after a healing in Mark 1:43 and Matthew 9:30. Every other appearance of this word carries real force behind it, not a gentle request, a stern, barely restrained command. Moved with compassion, the phrase some translations reach for instead, is doing real work smoothing over a word that left in its rawer sense sounds much closer to controlled anger than to tenderness. And here's the part worth being honest about rather than settling too fast. Scholars genuinely disagree about what that anger is aimed at. Some read it as anger at death itself, standing in front of one specific grave. Others read it as frustration at the surrounding unbelief, the crowd in verse 37 already second-guessing him, asking whether the man who opened blind eyes couldn't have kept his friend from dying. Still others connect it to what's coming next in the story, a man bracing himself before a decision that will eventually cost him his life. The text doesn't resolve which reading is correct, and this video won't pretend to either. What it does make unmistakable, groaned in the spirit, is not a synonym for felt sad. It's worth sitting with each of those 3 readings for a moment rather than rushing past them, because each one changes what kind of scene this actually is. If the anger is aimed at death itself, this becomes a scene about a creator confronting something that was never supposed to exist in his own world. Indignation at wrongness, not at a person. If it's aimed at the crowd's performative doubt, this becomes a much more uncomfortable scene, one where Jesus is frustrated with the very people he's about to comfort. And if it's aimed forward, at the decision closing in on him, this becomes a scene about dread as much as grief, a man bracing for a choice he already knows will end badly for him personally. None of the 3 readings cancels the others out entirely, and serious commentators have defended each one at length. What all 3 share is the same refusal to let this be a simple, single-note moment. Then verse 35, the famous 2 words, dakryō, a completely different verb from both klaiō and embrimaomai. Dakryō, meaning something more specific and more restrained than either. Quiet tears, without the audible lament klaiō carries. It's the only time this exact verb appears anywhere in the New Testament, applied to no one else, in no other scene, in any of the four Gospels. Whatever John is doing by switching verbs 3 times inside 6 verses, from the crowd's loud klaiō to Jesus's forceful embrimaomai, to his own singular dakryō, and back into embrimaomai again, it isn't careless writing. Greek had plenty of vocabulary available for grief. John had already used klaiō twice in this exact passage. He could have simply repeated it for Jesus and moved on. He chose not to, twice over.
And then verse 38 closes the bracket, again groaning in himself. The same embrimaom from verse 33, explicitly marked again right before Jesus tells them to roll the stone away. It's worth pausing on how little narrated time all of this covers. Verses 33 through 38 span at most a short walk from wherever Mary met Jesus to the tomb itself, a few minutes if that. Inside that short span, John records 3 distinct emotional words, one of them twice, for a man who is simultaneously surrounded by public grief, visibly forceful in his own reaction, quietly in tears for one private moment nobody else in the whole gospel gets described sharing with him, and then forceful again, before he says a single word to the dead man inside the tomb. The famous 2-word verse was never a stand-alone moment of gentle color. It's the calm center of something a lot closer to a storm than to a single tear. Picture it as 2 waves close together, with one narrow, quiet trough between them. That trough is the verse everyone memorized as a child, the easy one, the shortest one, sitting there the entire time as the calm center of something far rougher than a Sunday school poster ever let on. Nobody teaching that verse to a room full of children is lying to them exactly. They're just handing over the trough without mentioning the waves on either side of it, and a reader who only ever receives the trough has no way of knowing there was ever a storm attached to it at all. The word for Jesus' tears doesn't disappear after this chapter. It surfaces exactly once more in the one other scene in the Gospels where Jesus is at his most exposed. Hebrews 5:7 describes Gethsemane this way: who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death. Tears there translates dakryō, the noun form of the exact verb used for his weeping at Lazarus's tomb. 2 scenes, and only 2, in the entire New Testament where tear vocabulary attaches directly to Jesus himself: a graveside in Bethany facing someone else's death, and a garden outside Jerusalem hours before his own. The ordinary grief word klaiō keeps doing its ordinary job everywhere else without any of this extra weight. The sinful woman in Luke 7:38, washing Jesus' feet with her own tears, using the noun form dakryō in one of the only other places outside Jesus himself where the tear root shows up at all. Paul later describes his farewell to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20:19 and 20:31, using dakryō twice, serving the Lord with many tears, and recalls Timothy's own tears at their last parting in 2 Timothy 1:4. And Revelation closes the whole vocabulary out at the very end of the book. God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death. Dakryō again, the same root that named Jesus' own private tears, promised on the last page to be wiped away permanently. Lay the 2 Jesus scenes side by side, and the parallel sharpens. At Lazarus's tomb, he stands before someone else's death, about to reverse it. In Gethsemane, he faces his own, and this time there's no reversal. Hebrews goes on to say he was heard in that he feared, and then that though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. One scene ends in resurrection. the other ends in the cross. The tear root shows up at the threshold of both, not because Jesus was uniquely fragile compared to everyone else in the Gospels who weeps in these pages, but because both scenes happen to be the two places in the whole record where the text lets its audience see him fully unguarded, before either outcome has been decided. It's worth noticing how differently the two scenes are witnessed, too. At the tomb, Jesus is surrounded, Mary, Martha, a crowd of mourners, all watching him directly. In Gethsemane, the disciples closest to him are asleep only a short distance away, missing the very moment Hebrews describes as strong crying and tears. Both scenes technically have an audience nearby. Neither audience is actually paying attention to the specific moment of his own tears. That's part of why both had to be preserved in writing at all. A detail this private, witnessed this incompletely, survives only because someone thought it mattered enough to record anyway, secondhand and after the fact. If you're currently sitting with grief that doesn't feel like one clean emotion, if what you actually feel most days is something closer to anger than sadness, tangled together in a way that makes you feel like you're grieving wrong, this passage doesn't ask Jesus to pick one, and it doesn't ask you either. The embrimaomai doesn't get resolved into something softer before the tears come, and the tears don't stay soft for long before the anger returns at the tomb's entrance. Both get to be real at once, without either one canceling the other out. That's also the same honest instinct behind an earlier video on this channel. What the text actually says happens in the first hours after someone dies, not the softened version most people have heard secondhand. The two pair naturally if this subject matters to you right now.
And if there's someone in your life grieving today who's been quietly ashamed of how angry it's made them, as if the anger disqualifies the grief somehow, this is worth sending them directly, not because the point needs a bigger audience, but because permission like that lands easier coming from someone who already loves you. There's a second, smaller thing worth naming here too. Notice that Jesus doesn't grieve on a fixed schedule, and he doesn't grieve in front of an audience the entire time either. He's surrounded by mourners in verse 33, visibly forceful in front of them, and then, in the very next breath, weeping in a way the text records but never stages as a performance for the crowd around him. Grief that shows up privately, quietly, after the public reaction has already passed, isn't a delayed or incomplete version of grief. It's simply a different room of the same house. If your own grief hasn't looked like the version other people expected to see from you, loud where they wanted quiet, quiet where they wanted loud, this passage never asks you to perform it differently for anyone else's benefit. So here's the full shape of it. Verse 33, klaiō, loud and communal, grief the way it usually sounds from the outside. Same verse, same breath, embrimaomai, something closer to a horse's agitated snort than to sorrow, aimed at death, at unbelief, at what's coming, the text never fully resolving which. Verse 35, dakryō, quiet, private, reserved for Jesus alone in the whole New Testament. Verse 38, embrimaomai again, closing the bracket the same way it opened. And underneath all four, one more thread, the same word for tears resurfacing exactly once more in a garden hours before his own death. Of the three words in this passage, the loud weeping, the groaning, or the quiet tears, which one feels closest to where you actually are right now? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and this is exactly the kind of thing worth talking through together rather than sitting with alone. If pulling apart a verse everyone thinks they already understand is what keeps you here, subscribe. That's what this channel exists for. And if you're watching this today, here's a word for you. If grief and something closer to anger have been living in you side by side, and you weren't sure both were allowed, the man at that graveside didn't have to choose only one either.